Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows across the group huddled around it. Grandpa's voice took on a somber, distant tone as he began telling us about a mission that had haunted him for decades. I was young then, barely out of training, and ready to take on the world. Our unit had been assigned a 3-day patrol through one of the oldest and most remote sectors of the forest. There were 12 of us in total, men I trusted with my life. We called ourselves the Iron 12. He paused, gazing into the fire as if the flames held memories he hadn't dared revisit in years. The names of his comrades flowed slowly off his tongue. Captain Lewis, the brave and level-headed leader. Sergeant Dunn, who always carried a lucky charm. Private Riley, known for his sense of humor. And others, each one etched clearly in his memory. We had our quirks, our superstitions, but we had each other's backs, Grandpa said, his voice heavy with nostalgia. We packed light, just enough food, water, and ammunition for a few days, along with the gear we'd need to set up a makeshift base once we arrived. It was early dawn when we set out, the fog still hanging thick over the camp as we moved into the trees. Each step felt heavier, as though we were entering a different world, leaving behind the safety of our camp and venturing into the unknown. Something felt different on this patrol, Grandpa admitted. Maybe it was the stillness in the air, or the way the trees seemed to close in around us as we walked deeper into the woods. Captain Lewis led us forward, his face grim as he scanned the area with caution. After several hours, we reached a clearing and decided it was a good place to rest before heading toward the higher grounds to set up our observation post. There was a sense of relief among us as we took a breather, stretching out our legs and letting our guard down just a little. That's when I first noticed a helmet half buried in the mud just a few paces away. Something about it caught my attention. I picked it up, wiping the dirt away, and saw an old, faded name scratched into the metal. It wasn't one of ours, nor anyone we knew, but inside the helmet, there was something else, a small note, yellowed with age, but the words were still clear. I'm still here. My blood ran cold as I showed it to the others, and an uneasy silence fell over us. Captain Lewis looked at the note, his expression unreadable, before ordering us to move out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. The air grew colder as we set up our camp for the night on a ridge overlooking the valley. By the time darkness settled in, the only sounds were our own breathing and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Everyone was on edge, the note inside that helmet still fresh in our minds. None of us mentioned it, but I could tell from the wary glances that the others felt it to a strange weight in the air, like we were trespassers in a place long forgotten. We established a watch rotation, with Captain Lewis taking the first shift. As the night crept on, the usual camaraderie was replaced by uneasy silence. Even Private Riley, who could crack a joke in any situation, kept to himself. I tried to sleep, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the helmet and that haunting message. I'm still here, whose voice had written it. And why did I feel as though they were still somewhere near? Around midnight, it was my turn to take watch. I sat by the edge of the camp, the dark forest stretching out before me like a void. The shadows between the trees seemed thicker somehow, almost as if they were watching back. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, casting thin beams that only served to amplify the eerie shapes around me. Suddenly, there was a faint rustling sound from somewhere out in the woods. I swung my flashlight in the direction of the noise, squinting to see, but there was nothing, just the swaying branches and a heavy mist rolling in. I told myself it was just an animal, or maybe a stray breeze, but my gut told me something was off. I thought about waking Captain Lewis, but just as I turned, my eyes caught something lying on the ground, only a few feet from where I was sitting. It was the helmet. My stomach dropped as I realized it was the same helmet from earlier, the same mud-caked shell, with the same haunting note inside. I had left it miles back at the clearing. There was no way it could have followed us here. My hand shook as I reached out, gripping it just to confirm it was real. The cold metal felt almost like it was pulsing, as if it was alive with something unseen. I called for Captain Lewis, my voice barely steady. He hurried over, his eyes widening when he saw what I was holding. Didn't you leave this back there?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I whispered, unable to take my eyes off the helmet. "I don't know how it's here." Captain Lewis took it from my hands, studying it carefully. He unfolded the note, and I noticed his hand tremble just slightly as he held it up to the light. The words had changed. Instead of "I'm still here," it now read, "Don't leave me." A shiver went down my spine, and I felt the presence of something just beyond the trees, waiting, watching. Captain Lewis folded the note and tucked it back into the helmet, looking me dead in the eyes. "We're not alone out here," he said, his tone deadly serious. "Stay sharp, and don't mention this to the others. We need to keep moving at dawn." The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Every little noise made me jump, and every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Just before dawn, as we prepared to break camp, I noticed a set of footprints in the soft earth just beyond where we'd been sleeping. They weren't ours too small, to faint, like someone had been circling our camp all night. And in the middle of those footprints lay the helmet, waiting for us once more. We moved out as the first light broke over the ridge, the helmet wrapped tightly in a canvas bag, hidden from sight. Captain Lewis and I had agreed to keep the strange occurrences to ourselves, but an unspoken fear lingered. Every step felt heavier, every rustle of leaves sharper. The others noticed our tension and grew quieter, sensing something was off. "Are you all right?" I asked, reaching down to help him up. He looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. I thought I heard someone calling my name." Everyone exchanged uneasy glances. We hadn't spoken since we set out, and there hadn't been a sound except for our own footsteps. Still, there was no denying the terror in Hawley's face. Captain Lewis called for a brief halt, giving Hale a chance to recover, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As we stood there, the fog thickened around us, swirling in strange patterns. Suddenly, Private Garcia, our radio operator, went pale and pressed his hand to his earpiece. There's static coming through," he whispered. "But no one else should be transmitting in this area." He turned up the volume, and we all strained to listen. Amid the crackling static, a faint voice whispered through the radio, broken and garbled, but chillingly clear in its intent. "Don't leave me." The message repeated, growing slightly louder each time until the voice was clear enough to make out. It was pleading, desperate, and strangely familiar, as if it were coming from someone we knew but couldn't quite place. Garcia's face drained of color, his hands shaking as he tried to silence the radio, but the voice kept coming, relentless. The fog around us seemed to grow colder, thicker, until we could barely see one another. Shadows shifted in the mist, moving just out of sight, and I felt a presence, something watching us, circling like a predator sizing up its prey. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the fog lifted slightly, and we saw it, a lone figure standing a few yards away, half hidden in the mist. The figure was dressed in an old, tattered uniform, his face obscured by shadows, and he stood utterly still, as if waiting for us to approach. But there was something wrong. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his arms hung limp, like he was broken. Captain Lewis drew his weapon, his voice low and urgent. "Stay close, everyone. Don't engage." As we began to move, the figure seemed to drift with us, never advancing, yet never letting us leave him behind. The radio crackled again, and the voice returned, clearer this time, almost angry. "Why? Did you leave me?" Private Hale, now visibly shaking, stammered, Who is that? What does it want?" Nobody answered because none of us knew. The fog seemed to pulse, each step through it dragging us deeper into a suffocating dread. That's when I noticed the footprints behind us, wet, heavy prints that hadn't been there before. They were following us, mirroring our every step. Just when it felt like the pressure would drive us mad, the figure vanished. But the radio kept repeating, again and again, that same haunting line. "Why did you leave me?" We continued the march, too scared to stop. Every one of us hyper-aware of the shadows that seemed to press in, the whispers echoing through the static. But the footprints, they remained, following us as we walked, like someone unseen was marching to us behind. The helmet, though tucked away, weighed on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever haunted us wasn't finished yet. And in the silence, we all began to wonder the same thing. Who had we left behind, and would they ever let us leave? By dusk, we reached a ruined outpost, long abandoned, but still providing shelter from the eerie open field. We huddled close, the silence of the jungle around us thick with tension. The fog had mostly lifted, but shadows lingered, moving unnervingly just at the edges of our vision. None of us could shake the feeling that something was following us, waiting for us to make a mistake. The outpost was little more than crumbling walls and rusted equipment left over from battles long forgotten. Yet the moment we stepped inside, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over us. It was as if the air was heavier, thicker. Even the birds, usually a constant presence, were absent, leaving only the distant rustle of leaves and an unsettling quiet. As we settled in, Garcia suddenly broke the silence, his face pale and hands trembling. He held out his radio, which was still faintly buzzing with static, as if something or someone was trying to communicate. He whispered. I heard it again, the voice, but this time it called each of us by name. Our blood ran cold as we looked at each other. None of us wanted to believe him, but Garcia had never been one to joke, especially not about something like this. We listened as he adjusted the radio, and sure enough, beneath the hiss of static, we heard it. Our names, whispered one by one, growing louder each time, as if whoever it was could see us, feel us, even read our thoughts. A chill ran down my spine as my name echoed through the radio. It was a voice I recognized, but couldn't place a voice filled with bitterness, pain, and betrayal. Captain Lewis broke the silence, his tone sharp. Enough. This, whatever it is, it's trying to scare us. We're not leaving until we complete our mission. Trying to focus, we set up watches for the night. The patrol rotations began, but nobody was getting any sleep. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow somehow darker, hiding something we couldn't see. As my turn on watch approached, I steeled myself, gripping my rifle tightly, eyes darting at every movement. Around midnight, Hale, who was on watch, suddenly froze, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the outpost. He looked terrified, his face drained of all color. I followed his gaze and saw what he was staring at, the helmet. It was sitting up right against the wall, even though we had buried it outside when we first arrived. What? How did it get here? Garcia whispered, stepping back. No one dared touch it, and yet it seemed to draw us in, daring us to approach. Hale finally whispered, I don't think it wants us here. I don't think it ever left. Just then, we heard it, the same faint footsteps from earlier, approaching from just outside the crumbling walls, getting louder with each passing second. They echoed, hollow and deliberate, as if something unseen was circling the outpost, looking for a way in. My heart pounded as we all drew closer, weapons at the ready, forming a tight circle, each of us scanning the perimeter. Suddenly, the air grew icy cold, and the radio crackled to life again. This time, the voice was clear and unmistakable. You shouldn't have left me behind. The voice was filled with such anguish, such betrayal, that I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was like a wounded animal calling out for justice, for revenge. Hale was visibly shaking now, his grip on his rifle loose as he muttered, Who did we leave behind?" As if in response, a dark figure appeared just outside the broken wall, watching us with hollow, sunken eyes. He wore a tattered uniform, and though his face was obscured, we could feel his gaze, a gaze full of hatred, focused directly on us. Lewis whispered, "That can't be real. We're imagining things." But his voice was unsteady, betraying the fear we all felt. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward, his movements slow but purposeful. The footsteps echoed, loud and menacing, as he entered the outpost, crossing into our line of sight, coming closer. We aimed our rifles, but our hands were shaking, fear gripping us like an iron vice. We could barely breathe as he came to a stop, inches from the helmet, bending down to pick it up. The figure raised it, cradling the helmet in his hands, before lifting his head to look directly at us, his face now visible. It was a soldier, one of our own, or at least he had been, years ago. His eyes were empty, his face hollowed by pain and anger. The radio crackled one last time, the words hissing like venom. "I waited for you." And in that moment, we realized that this wasn't just any spirit. This was someone who had been forgotten, someone who had died waiting for rescue, someone who believed we had abandoned him. His voice, his presence, the helmet, they were all reminders of a betrayal none of us could recall, but that he would never forget. As the apparition faded, the cold lingered, and we were left standing there in silence, unable to shake the guilt that clung to us like the damp air. We had come face to face with something beyond our understanding, and I knew that, from this moment on, we would never leave any man behind, no matter the cost. After that eerie encounter, we were rattled to the core, yet there was no option to abandon the mission. Captain Lewis gathered us in the dim light of the camp lantern, his voice low and tense. "We're finishing this, but we do it with respect. Whoever or whatever that spirit was, we've got to find a way to honor him, to put him to rest." None of us spoke, but I could see the fear mixed with grim determination in everyone's eyes. We were not just dealing with an enemy or a hostile patrol. We were up against the restless spirit of a forgotten brother in arms. As dawn broke, we retraced our steps, hoping to uncover some sign of the soldier's past. The helmet had returned to the same muddy spot, almost as if waiting for us. It looked ancient and battered, the kind issued years before any of us even enlisted. I knelt down, brushing the dirt off its surface, revealing faint initials carved into the inside rim. JH. I whispered, "JH, does that mean anything to anyone?" No one responded, but a shadow of recognition seemed to cross Garcia's face. I heard of him once. An old story passed down through the unit, a soldier named James Hargrove, lost in enemy territory. They say he was waiting for a patrol that never came. Captain Lewis nodded, his face grim. "Then we owe him. We find his remains and bury him with honor." We began a search of the surrounding area, methodically combing through the dense jungle, keeping our eyes open for any sign of where this soldier might have fallen. As we moved deeper, the feeling of unease returned, thicker than before, as if the forest itself were watching us. Hours passed, the shadows growing longer. Just as we were about to turn back, Garcia shouted, "Over here." We gathered around to find him standing over a shallow mound, half covered in dense foliage. As we dug, it became clear that this was an old grave, marked only by a crude stick cross hidden among the vines and dirt. At the base, partially buried, lay the fragments of a military uniform, worn and faded. I felt a chill run down my spine. We had found James Hargrove. Captain Lewis knelt, placing the helmet gently atop the grave. He muttered a quick, solemn prayer, honoring the fallen soldier's memory. We all stood silent, offering a moment of respect for the life lost and the decades spent in restless limbo. But as we rose to leave, a deep cold settled over us. The wind had stopped, the jungle eerily silent. We felt it before we saw it, the same shadowy figure from the outpost, emerging slowly from the dense brush. This time, his face was more visible, and his eyes held an emotion that shook us, sorrow mixed with a glint of gratitude. In a hoarse whisper, he said, "Thank you for remembering." And then, like mist in the morning sun, he faded, leaving only a faint trace of his presence. The jungle air grew warm again, the strange weight lifted. We felt relief and a strange peace settle over us. We gathered our gear, each of us feeling that we had not only completed a mission, but also laid a lost soul to rest. In silence, we began our trek back to camp, knowing we'd never forget the soldier who waited nor the promise we made to never let another fall into the silence of memory. Returning to camp, each of us carried an unspoken weight, a feeling both of closure and loss. Captain Lewis ordered us to rest, but sleep was elusive. We lay in silence, staring at the dark sky, thoughts drifting back to James Hargrove, the soldier who had waited all those years in the jungle, unseen and forgotten. The next morning, as we gathered around the fire, Garcia spoke up. "Do you think he's really gone now that he found peace?" Captain Lewis, who rarely shared his thoughts, looked contemplatively into the fire. "Sometimes, all someone needs is acknowledgement. He waited for us, for someone to remember him. Now he can finally move on." We nodded in agreement, but as the day wore on, an unsettling sensation crept back in, one we had thought we'd left in the jungle. Small things started happening, a whisper carried on the wind, the faint sound of boots crunching on leaves, a flash of movement in our peripheral vision. It was as though Hargrove's spirit was making sure we hadn't forgotten our promise so quickly. That evening, as we gathered for a final debrief before heading back to base, Captain Lewis brought out an old notebook. This belonged to Hargrove. I found it buried by his grave. It's almost like he left it for us. He opened it, revealing faded, shaky handwriting. The entries were mostly short, hastily scrawled notes about patrols, his unit, and loneliness. But one passage near the end struck us all. In it, Hargrove had written about a premonition, a sense that he wouldn't make it back. His last entry read, "If I don't make it, if they find this, tell them I waited, tell them I was here." The weight of his words settled over us, and an odd silence blanketed the camp. We knew now that his spirit had not just waited for rescue, but also for someone to bear witness to his story. As we prepared to leave, Captain Lewis buried the notebook beneath the outpost flagpole, marking it with a simple plaque in Hargrove's honor. We each took a moment by the small memorial, offering our silent farewells. It felt like a final step, a way to truly say goodbye. When night fell and we embarked on our return journey, there was no longer a feeling of someone following us. The jungle was quiet, almost peaceful. It seemed as if Hargrove's spirit was now at rest. Years later, whenever I recall that mission, I can still see Hargrove's solemn face, hear the distant whisper of his words on the wind. Our squad might have moved on, but a part of us will always be back there in that jungle, standing in silent remembrance of the soldier who waited. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.